You've recorded a podcast episode, and now what? Where does it go, and how do I get it there? Welcome to Geelong Podcasters, your weekly podcast for tips and tricks to grow your audience. We are a group of passionate podcasters located in Geelong and the Bellarine in Victoria, Australia. If you're down our way at the end of the month, why not come to one of our free monthly meetup events? And also, find the booking links and more in the show notes. We're going to be talking about podcast hosting platforms, generating an RSS feed, and distributing your podcast. Now, if that just seems like a lot of words, do not worry, I'm here for you. The best way that I have to explain when it comes to distributing your podcast, so let's imagine you've created your podcast, you've recorded it, you sat down to figure out, okay, why am I making this and who am I making this for? And you've recorded your first episode or maybe a trailer, and you're ready for it to go out into the world. How do you do that? Well, you do that by uploading your podcast and subsequent podcast episodes on what is called a podcast hosting platform. The way that I explain this to clients and people that I work with regarding podcasting is thinking about your podcast episode being a book in a library. The library is the place where the book is being housed, and that's where people know to go to be able to get that book, your podcast episode, whenever they want to listen to it, consume it, download it, or be able to listen to it later on. That's how most podcasting works. And yes, you could technically do this yourself, but there are plenty of services and also free services available to do all the heavy lifting for you. This does require a little bit of time and effort on your part to make sure that the podcast episode has all the information that the hosting platform needs to make sure that they can showcase your podcast to the people who want to hear about it. And also it makes it easier for you to allow people to say, hey, follow my podcast. All they need to do is go to their podcast player of choice. It calls out to the podcast hosting platforms to get your podcast, and it will be there waiting for them ready to listen to. So let me break down the three things that I mentioned at the top of this episode. A podcast hosting platform is a service that allows you to host your platforms in a digital space. Think of platforms like Libsyn, Podbean, Spotify for podcasters, YouTube podcasts. There are plenty of platforms out there, both paid and free, that enable you to host your content online. Now, I'm not going to get into the reasons between free and paid hosting platforms. That is for another podcast entirely. But essentially, when you're starting out, you do have the option to go with a more paid option if, say, for example, you want to invest a lot more time and effort and want to get a lot more data and information back regarding your podcast following and growing it, then a paid service might be for you. But if you're doing this, say, as a hobby or maybe an addition to your business and you don't have an existing market that you could guarantee income or sponsorships from, maybe starting with a free hosting platform may be the way to go for the time being. You can always move your data or your hosting to another platform. This does take time, but to be honest, it's actually not as hard as people say it is. I've done like 3 this week. But essentially what these hosting platforms are doing, very much like a library, is a place where your podcast is going to be held in a digital place where people can go to, and they're going to create what is called an RSS feed. RSS feed. Essentially, this is a really simplified version, essentially a link that you get provided where people can use this in their podcast players on their phones or on their devices, and it automatically goes out, say, once every hour, once every 2 hours, to see, are there any updates on this particular feed for this podcast? If that's a yes, then they download the podcast or they show the person who owns the device saying, hey, there's a new podcast from this player. It does this using the RSS feed. And when it comes to other platforms that you may be more familiar with, say, for example, like like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Podcasts, all of those other, like Stitcher, Podchaser, all those other platforms use the RSS feed generated by your podcast hosting platforms to get that information ready to go, to be able to download to their device or listen to while streaming it from the actual podcast hosting platform of choice. Now, I know this may seem like a lot of work, but ultimately finding a platform that you can stick to, giving it as much information that you can about your podcast, including descriptions, detailed information about what your podcast episode is about and who's it for, as well as other information that obviously will be given. And from there, you've uploaded and distributed your podcast. Congratulations. This podcast is sponsored by me, Zoe, the Video Confidence Coach, connecting the dots of your personal brand with the power of video. See more in the show notes. Speaking of show notes, see all the show notes, including links, upcoming events, and details for this episode and many more in the episode description, or just go to vcc.training/Geelong-Podcasters. Make sure you tune in for next week.